Hello and welcome to the first AI eDisclosure on Demand webinar. My name's Attila Erin and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by James MacGregor, the founder of Ethical eDiscovery and chair of the ILTA Litigation Support Special Interest Group. James and other members of the group have produced an active learning best practice guide for eDisclosure and eDiscovery professionals to follow, and they are hoping for it to be endorsed by the courts in the UK. James has also run a couple of live events where the group discussed why the guide was created and some of the details contained within it. However, today we'll be discussing how to apply the active learning guide in practice, and we'll be looking at that step by step. If you haven't read the guide already, please do so via the resources page on ILTA's website, and I'll share a link along with the post to this video. Now let's get straight into it. James, thank you for joining me today. It's a privilege to have you. How are you?
Thanks, Attila. Well, look, I really appreciate the opportunity to promote this guide. As you said in your introduction, I've been hawking this all over town, so I'm grateful that you've given me a chance to talk to you about it here. Yeah, doing well, thanks. I'm happy to get stuck into it, I guess with the caveat that there may be some components in terms of questions that you're going to ask me about how to use it in the process of a project that I may need to defer to other experts on.
The first step is identifying the population for an active learning project. The guide suggests that too much time should not be spent on agreeing keywords. Now, is this case specific? Is there still value in identifying a subset of documents for an active learning project by using keywords? For example, would a population of 50,000 responsive documents in an active learning project be better than a population of 1 million documents where no keywords have been applied, or is this redundant now?
So I suppose the thing to bear in mind when thinking about how to use this guide is that it was created as a consensus document. So we brought opinions from a variety of different eDiscovery practitioners at law firms, as well as eDiscovery service providers and software providers. And what we were trying to create was sort of a standard that you could follow on almost every project. And for that reason, it wasn't specific in terms of you could only apply keywords, or you must apply keywords on every project, and it only applies to projects where there are 50,000 documents or more. What I would say, one of the things that crops up often around the discussion of keywords is when to use those in the context of a project depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So if we accept that actually during the phase of litigation, what you might want to do is negotiate with the other side. And a way that you might negotiate with the other side is you'll agree keywords. And in so doing, as you're refining them, you're also agreeing what the total population of documents are that are to be reviewed. And by doing so, that way you can establish what the cost would be to review them. And that exercise in itself it may not be the perfect way to find all the relevant material in a data set, but it follows the process of a standard disclosure in the courts of England and Wales, and similarly in other jurisdictions as well. So it's still an appropriate methodology to employ when going through an eDiscovery exercise. But one of the criticisms that we had from people when we were putting this guide together is that if you're thinking about using machine learning in its purest sense, you can dispense with keywords altogether. In theory, you should just start coding documents from the very beginning. And then as you're coding documents, the algorithm is automatically going to update and bring back other documents based on your coding decisions. So keywords doesn't necessarily further your objective if your objective is just to find all the relevant information in a data set. But as we know, in the context of civil litigation, and when you're undergoing a disclosure exercise, that is not your sole objective. You know, the practice of eDisclosure is within the larger context of a case. And as such, it's actually the implementation of keywords is a perfectly accepted practice as a way of reducing the amount of information that you're looking at. And so therefore it does kind of fit into an overall workflow. So there was a fair amount of disagreement amongst the panel of the people that put this together in terms of what document population is useful whereby you could switch on active learning. There were many people that suggested 20,000 documents was a perfectly good threshold. And ultimately, I guess it depends on where the benefits are by following an active learning workflow. I mean, if you're talking about 10,000 documents, yeah, you could turn on active learning, but actually to review 10,000 documents manually, it doesn't really save you that much time or is that much more advantageous to follow that process. Given that it's free in the majority of eDiscovery tools anyway, and if nothing else, it will group like documents with like documents, which will speed up the review, assuming you're still going to look at everything in the document population. Why not turn it on? I mean, there's no benefit to not having it. I guess the only counter argument to that might be in a scenario where you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of documents and actually you're not going to be looking at everything. If you put active learning on, then maybe there's a danger that if you haven't run search terms or if you haven't narrowed your data set originally just to find material which is likely to be rich in relevance, then you're going to spend a lot of time training a model on data, and so that will take longer. So I suppose, I mean, there are a variety of different approaches that are feasible, but there's no reason from a cost standpoint, at least, not to turn it on.
I think also if you are going to use keywords, then keep them as wide as possible. I'm looking at analytics and text poor documents now. So first, let's begin with analytics. The guide states that selective use of various analytic tools can be successfully incorporated alongside active learning. So it's suggesting that using different analytics, there's value to that alongside active learning. Two tools that come to my mind when I think about running analytics are email threading to remove redundant email chains, and then textual near duplicate identification to potentially remove duplicate documents from the population. What are your thoughts on these two features, and are there any other analytics that should be used to optimize the index performance of your active learning project?
So yeah, two great examples. There was an active learning project I was working on recently, and the coding decisions meant that lots of very similar documents were getting put in front of the reviewers time and time again, and they were understandably getting frustrated because they thought they'd already reviewed this document, and actually it's because we hadn't done any textual near deduplication. And when we then set the threshold to, I don't know, it was like 97% or thereabouts, we immediately eradicated a whole bunch of information which was on the face of it relevant, but actually it's not something that the review team needed to consider. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of a tool that should be applied alongside active learning in order to make the reviewer's time more efficient. And email threading, same logic, right? If you're not providing the whole inclusive email thread to review as one document, but instead you're coding each individual component of an email thread, then that's going to bring back that same email which has been seen by the review team many times before, which is unnecessary for them to tag again, because ultimately if they just tag the inclusive thread, then that should be sufficient. So I think those are two great examples that you should use alongside an active learning approach. I guess another one in terms of analytics tools. So same project I was working on where initially active learning was being followed. In this instance, it was an internal investigation, and there was one individual, and we were trying to establish whether this individual had been colluding with lots of other people in the business. So it wasn't a litigation, it was an internal investigation. And so the objective was not to find as much relevant data within the data set. In fact, it was to see if this individual had been communicating with a few key people around the time of a few specific fraudulent events. And so we were better off doing some communication mapping to find out, okay, well, this person is regularly communicating with these two individuals during these timeframes when we know that nefarious behavior is occurring. We want to look at these specific correspondences because it's likely that we'll either be able to tell whether this individual was in collusion with these others or if they were acting alone. And in so doing, we looked at significantly less data than we would have done had we just been trying to find all relevant material in the data set. And as a result, we were able to establish in this case that the individual was acting alone, and therefore all of this other information, which may have been relevant if we were in a litigation, was actually irrelevant to this investigation, and we could shut it down pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, I think all eDiscovery tools have a whole suite of analytics options available within them, and you need to use the right tool for the right job. So you have to think, and that's the beauty and the challenge of eDiscovery, right? Sometimes sometimes a case exactly mirrors one that you've done before, and you can use your experience in order to follow the same strategy. And sometimes you're trying to achieve a very different outcome, or it's a very different data set, and you need to use different tools available. One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the text poor documents, just because it's, I think, good insight into the discussions we had when putting this guide together. So it seems to be pretty standard workflow for people that if you're dealing with a case and in it you have a bunch of images, the example that was cited was CAD drawings in relation to a construction dispute, for example, that those images should be excluded from an active learning workflow because active learning works on text based within images, and therefore it should be taken out. But then, according to some of the data scientists who contributed to our paper, they said, no, those documents shouldn't be excluded. Again, I guess it goes back to the kind of search term debate that we were talking about before. If you're thinking about machine learning in its purest sense, there shouldn't be any culling of the population at all. I don't know. I can't pretend to be an expert enough in the science to know which of those is the right methodology, but the text poor documents, eradicating those from your normal workflow, to me just seems again like a kind of practical approach, because when you're thinking about reviewing that information, again, you're going to review drawings in a very different way that you're going to review emails. Same for audio data or something. There we go. Transcription is another good example that you might want to engage in. I don't know. I feel like I'm sort of providing a further caveat in terms of what's included in this guide, but we're trying to achieve a best practice that you can follow, which is a practical approach in every matter that can obviously be deviated from depending on the other tools that are available, but ultimately is to encourage lawyers and case teams to use more technology where possible to eliminate the need for more manual traditional review.
I see. Yeah. So don't limit the number of analytics or other kind of tools and tech that you can use just because you're using active learning.
Yeah, exactly.
The guide references Practice Direction 57 AD, which parties should be prepared to explain why TAR will not be used in any case where the review population exceeds 50,000 documents. It also mentions that active learning can be used for fewer than 1,000 documents. However, where there is validation required, then 15,000 is suggested to be the threshold. What were the thoughts behind this, and what is the smallest project size you've used in an active learning project?
So the reason that we mentioned 50,000 documents is our hope for this guide, and maybe the reason for starting this project in the first place is because following the practice direction guidance, I think, and this was borne out by all the heads of eDiscovery that were in the room and that wanted to create this, there was still lots of confusion around, okay, it says technology assisted review, but that's a very broad term, and it doesn't actually advise clients on how to run a technology assisted review. I mean, we're talking about active learning, but you understand what I'm talking about. And particularly for less sophisticated law firms who don't have people like you in-house and maybe don't have eDiscovery software, there's no guidance to them as to how to use the technology available in the context of eDiscovery to make their workflows more efficient. And so often people like you may find yourselves on the other side of a claimant or a defendant who's represented by a law firm who doesn't have the knowledge around what tools and analytics technology, such as we've already discussed, are available. And therefore they're less inclined to trust what you're saying by way of the technology you're proposing and the way that you're going to handle a project. And so I think it's important to note that whilst the practice direction went a long way in terms of encouraging the adoption of technology, what it didn't do is it didn't advise exactly how you can use the technology. And why we wrote this guide is so that people now know what tools are out there and they can get a bit of a sense as to the practices that they can follow, so that when they're in front of a judge, they can say, we followed the ILTA best practices guide for the use of active learning on our project, which is in adherence to practice direction 57 AD. So that was kind of the rationale for the project in the first place. And then, with respect to the size of the population, I mean, we've covered that somewhat already. It's somewhat subjective, obviously, and there's no reason not to turn it on whenever. But I guess that was the rationale for building this in the first place, and why we want it closely linked to Practice Direction 57 AD. And that's why we've taken this consensus document and we've submitted it to Sir Geoffrey Voss, the Master of the Rolls, in the hope that there will then be a wider consultation from the courts with other people, effectively to anoint this guide, either to be incorporated within the practice direction, or at least just to be acknowledged. Because I think the other benefit of having something like this is lawyers operate by way of precedent. So in the same way that you don't want to use a technology which no one's used before because you can't validate whether or not it's effective, you also don't want to, to approach a project in a way which no one else endorses or recognizes, because then you open yourself up to risk that you've missed documents or you've not followed an agreed best practice. And so the purpose of this is to have a gold standard whereby the next time you're in a dispute with another law firm, you can both say, we adhered to these best practices, and that's how we got to the documents which we subsequently disclosed to one another. And so you're both following a gold standard that you're happy with, which ultimately is the mission of litigation in the courts of England and Wales. It's supposed to be cooperative when it comes to the mechanics of disclosure. This is the way for both sides to agree on an approach which has been endorsed by many of the major law firms in London.
Training the model then. Most platforms allow you to create your own active learning project without a seed set or a very small number of reviewed documents. So I know one platform that I'm using currently, you need one relevant and one not relevant, but once a threshold of something like 50 documents have been reviewed, the model begins to build. Should legal teams review a seed set to begin with? And if so, how do you calculate the number of documents for this?
It's still pretty accepted that you want to have a subject matter expert engaged at the beginning of a review to train the model, because the challenge you have, if you have lots of reviewers doing the initial coding, and those reviewers will code documents differently, it will take longer for the model to train, and potentially you may actually also, in those early coding decisions, whilst it's continuous active learning, you're just creating extra wasted time, because if people are making different decisions, then the model's just not going to update as quickly as it should. With respect to seed sets, as you say, it's tool specific, right? Some of them require different levels. I'm thinking back to the days when we used to work with big review teams. And what we would do is we would create a calibration set at the start of a review exercise where you would kind of cherry pick 100 documents, and those would normally be a random seed sample. But you would then provide the reviewer briefing note to all of the reviewers and then have them all code those documents. And they would often code them differently because people have different views in terms of whether a document is relevant or not, or whether it might be pertinent to a certain issue. And that was a good exercise because then it would allow the reviewers, you could recognize which reviewers hadn't quite understood the briefing. And sometimes the briefing might be adjusted because actually the person in charge didn't know what was contained within the data set. So it was always a bit of an iterative process. So, yeah, I mean, I think my own personal view is that choose a seed set. Ideally, you want it to be a random sample that contains data, that is both rich in relevance, but also some non-relevant documents. And then you want to have the person who has the most knowledge about the case responsible for reviewing that data, at least at the onset, because that's going to yield the best results. But I realize that's not always possible. And, particularly in matters, more often than not, it's the more junior people that are actually responsible for the document review. And so it can be a bit of a cultural change at a law firm to get a senior person involved in that kind of review exercise.
If you're reviewing a random sample of documents as a seed set, then why not just review a random sample of documents in your active learning project to begin with anyway? So my view is to just kind of start the project instantly and let the model learn from those decisions. But that's not to say it's the best option. And if for example, you know a subset of documents is relevant or not relevant, then definitely using a seed set in that example would be beneficial rather than just chucking them into active learning and waiting for them to be served for review.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I suppose it probably stems from the way that TAR 1.0, technology assisted review, the first version was run, whereby you would have your seed set and you would code those. And because the algorithm wasn't continuously updating, this is probably the reason that people run these projects in that way. But actually, the technology's evolved beyond then and just kickstart the project. And in so doing, automatically, the more coding decisions you make, assuming that you've configured the algorithm appropriately, you're going to be front loaded with the documents that it believes are most relevant. And that way, it's as effective a tool as it would be to run those traditional sets.
Yeah, and there's something that a platform I'm using has, which is called coverage review. I don't know if all platforms have this, but it's a method by which reviewers focus on reviewing documents closely scored around the 50 mark. So kind of where the system is still a bit unsure how to rank them. It's not rank them high, it's not rank them low, it's in the middle. And so this is meant to help train the model faster by putting the documents into two separate buckets and score them closer to 0 and 100. So instead of thinking about using a seed set, you could also think about using coverage review. But I do understand that this isn't commonly used, and a prioritized review is the preferred option in most cases.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen coverage review run previously as well. And yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It makes sense if you're trying to quickly get the system to make a call on those documents, which it is unable to classify as, one way or the other. And, again, I guess it all depends on what the case objectives are, what other tools and technologies you may be using. And yeah, how much time you've got and how many people are going to be involved in the process.
Moving on to quality control QC processes. So we've already started the active learning project. The legal team have been reviewing for a few days. What QC checks do you recommend should be performed in a typical case after the review has started? And what signs do you look for?
This is completely subjective, I guess, ultimately. And, I think going back to the first point, it will depend a lot on how many reviewers you've got engaged. And, the more hands you have in this, the more strict quality control processes you need. So, again, if you've got just a core of a few subject matter experts who know exactly what the case is about and what they're looking for, and are experienced reviewers and are comfortable using the review tool they are using, then your quality control should be lesser. That's not to say that it shouldn't happen, because in the same way that I described the old-fashioned approach, whereby you would do a calibration set, and after doing so, inevitably you would have to update the review briefing, because having looked at the data, that kind of informs the way that you're coding different documents. And the same is true even if you've got subject matter experts doing the review at the very beginning. They may actually start to change as the review changes, and maybe there are other things alongside the disclosure process that are happening in the case, which also means that the strategy starts to shift a little bit. But I think a lot of it depends on the scoring that we talked about of those documents. And if you've got many of them sitting around the 50-50 mark, and if it's taking and if as the review progresses still there's a huge population that sits around the 50-50 mark, you can be pretty clear that something's going wrong here. There's got to be some inconsistency in coding, or there's something wrong within the data set. And so, the longer that progresses, then the harder it is to turn the project around afterwards. So, the general rule of thumb is, it's measure twice, cut once, right? At the beginning of the project, you should be QCing as much as possible, just to ensure that everyone is comfortable that there's a consistency in coding decision, and then you can taper that off once the model starts to stabilize.
So there are some standard QCs that I run for active learning projects, but I also emphasize that it's important to speak with the legal teams regularly on the progress of the review and find out how they're doing. By having those discussions with the legal teams as well, you're finding out what QC searches you need to run, because maybe they've done something that needs to be rectified. But it's important to also kind of clarify at the start of a project that we need to look at the four corners rule. So only review and mark documents based on the four corners of the window. Don't look at families or other external factors to mark documents for relevance. And if you do, then, for a small set, then it's not a problem. But if it's all of the documents that have been reviewed or a big set of documents, then we might need to re-review. We're talking about those standard QC searches, then things I look at documents that are above or at my cutoff score, which are marked not relevant. So, the system is saying they're likely relevant, but you said they're not relevant. And then vice versa, things that are below my cutoff score that are marked relevant, but the system is saying they're not relevant. So I would then sort them in order of, the highest to lowest first for my first QC, and then, the ones where we're looking at anything below my cutoff, I would sort them from the lowest scored documents, bringing them to the legal team's attention first. And depending on how many there are, we may do a sample of them rather than all of them. Also, depending on whether they're overturning those decisions, are they overturning 90% of those documents, in which case keep going, or are they just, the system hasn't learned enough about what's relevant yet. And then one other thing is duplicates. So, we talked about using textual near duplicate identification to remove duplicates, but I had a matter where we hadn't done that, and duplicates were inconsistently tagged, and so I had to get a senior member of the review team to then QC review all the duplicates that were tagged differently. Next thing is stabilization, and to see whether the model is able to correctly score documents. At what point should SMEs begin the validation process, or at least consider it? And what should SMEs do if the model does not appear to be stabilizing?
So this was a challenging one that we were unable to really provide a gold standard on this. There were differences of opinion across the various people that drafted the document, because people also wanted to know about thresholds to set and percentages, whether those could be exchanged. And it was just agreed that that wasn't something that people would be comfortable sharing directly, because it just so varies depending on the data set. In terms of, the one thing that seemed to be pretty commonplace across all the different software that people were using is that the most systems will tell you when they're reaching a point of stabilization. So that's the obvious indicator. And then in terms of the statistical sampling that you can do, I guess again it's subjective, and it's a question of, are those documents that are coded at 50%, are they, is that column staying pretty static? Is it still updating? If it's staying pretty static, then you can probably suggest that the system is stable or stable-ish, and actually it's unable to make much of a call on that. But it's a question of looking at the graphic that you get, where you can see how documents are being coded, and then just the more that you run these projects, and knowing what's in the data set, you can get a feel for whether we're approaching stabilization or not. But unfortunately, there isn't really a hard and fast rule for these.
I look at that rank distribution chart and see, how many documents are being scored on either side of the spectrum. And in terms of kind of getting ready for validation, the first thing I look for is, have we reviewed everything above our cutoff point? If not, then I always recommend that everything above that cutoff is reviewed. And then also that when the relevance rate kind of begins to dip, at the beginning of the project, it normally fluctuates until the model understands how many documents are likely relevant, and then the relevance rate is kind of high, so around the 90% area, and then it gradually begins to dip. And once it kind of hits a really low threshold, that's when I start to suggest, let's begin the validation process. It also kind of does depend on the type of case as well, doesn't it? So, for example, if you're dealing with a fraud case, I don't think you want to fix a percentage.
One of the reasons that we didn't put in specific percentages was because this guide we're hoping will be used by non-practitioners, not eDiscovery professionals, but legal teams directly. And if you hold a particular percentage in there, there's a chance that you may not hit that percentage. And in theory, you could spend all of your time going through the review until you got to that threshold, and it never got reached. And as such, you just open yourself up for criticism. And I suppose, as with all of this stuff, the point is to try and provide enough information that you can follow a standard and adhere to it without being too prescriptive around the specifics, because it really is case specific. And there were certainly people around the table during discussions who said, we would never share our percentages with the other side on a case. And there were other people who said, yeah, we turn our percentages over and we would agree them and say, this is what we've done.
Can you explain what the recall, precision, and F-scores are? This is something many people will struggle with, I think, so any clarity would be helpful.
Precision, recall, and F-scores are statistical measures used in an eDiscovery context to estimate the effectiveness of document retrieval algorithms such as search terms, active learning, and human review. Precision is the proportion of documents retrieved that are truly relevant, and recall is the proportion of all relevant documents that were retrieved. And F-scores are an average of the two.
How do you close a review?
It's a negotiation with the other side, right? It comes down to, again, it's the precision and recall rates, whilst important, are just one component in the wider negotiation with the other side, assuming that this is a litigation within the courts of England and Wales, and it comes down to proportionality and how much time and money has been spent to achieve these percentages. And based therefore, and this is why you do your validation process, and you continue to do your sampling, you can get a sense that these percentages may update by a fraction, but the number of documents that would need to be reviewed in order for them to update by a fraction would cost Y amount, and you therefore make the case to the other side that it would be disproportionate in order to progress with the review at this stage, because you're not actually going to yield back any materially relevant information, and the cost to adjust these percentages by just a small fraction would be far higher than is proportionate to the value of the claim.
When do you expect the practice guide to be endorsed by the courts in the UK?
As mentioned, when we published it, we submitted it to the Master of the Rolls. We've had confirmation that it's been received. We've got a champion of the project who's a former judge, who's also helping us ensure that it stays on the agenda of the Master of the Rolls. As you may have seen from some of the recent press coverage, there's increasing attention from the media to see whether artificial intelligence can be used more in the practice of law, with a view to increasing access to justice. And I think this guide kind of fits within that agenda, albeit we're talking about using it in a civil context. There's no reason why this technology and these principles couldn't be applied to a criminal context as well. So I think there's a reasonable chance it will be taken up soon. Doing podcasts like this helps us get the message out and apply further pressure to have it happen. So yeah, I'll stay posted, I guess. We'll keep working on it, and any updates we'll be sure to let you and your listeners know.
Perfect. Thanks, James. So that's all we have time for today. A huge thank you to James for joining me and sharing such valuable insights on the new Active Learning Best Practices Guide. I encourage you all to review the guide and consider how these best practices can be applied to your cases as soon as possible. If you found this session useful and would like to see more videos like this, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.